Kristallnacht. On the night of November 8th, 1938, the sounds of breaking glass shattered the air in cities throughout Germany and parts of Austria. Fires across the countries devoured synagogues and Jewish institutions. By the end of the rampage, gangs of Nazi stormtroopers had destroyed 7,000 Jewish businesses, set fire to more than 900 synagogues, killed 91 Jews, and deported some 30,000 Jewish men to concentration camps. That's from PBS, pbs.org. I'm Kent Lindstrom. This is the Something Ventured podcast. This is our second edition. We'll talk today a little bit about I guess the topic is wealth disparity in San Francisco. There's been a thing going on here in Silicon Valley, somewhere under the topic of wealth disparity. That is, on the one hand, somewhat complex and somewhat heavy, and on the other hand, somewhat silly. But certainly the Kristallnacht part is not. And I'll walk you through a little bit of what is going on there. So first of all, let me start with the small thing that's going on. We'll build up to the ridiculous Kristallnacht story. And I do this podcast just because this is such an insane and crazy thing. It just seems that it needs to go remarked upon at some point. And then we'll move on and hopefully never talk about this topic again in anything but the most lighthearted fashion. So it's happened in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco in particular, for those of you who don't live in San Francisco, for those of you who are around the world, is that a certain amount of wealth has been created here in Silicon Valley. Now, a certain amount of wealth has been created in many industries around the world. But here in Silicon Valley in particular, it's somewhat visible. It's somewhat visible for a couple of reasons. One is that it's spectacularly interesting. Never in history have guys like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, become worth $25-30 billion when they're 24, 25 years old. So even a master of the universe in New York City making $10 million a year has no idea what the hell is going on in Silicon Valley. So that's very dramatic. And there's two other highly sort of visual things that are happening as wealth is created in Silicon Valley. For example, a company called WhatsApp went public last week. WhatsApp is a messaging app with an audience, it should be noted, of 450 million people, and that was bought for $19 billion. That company employs about 50 people. So the other two visible things that are happening in San Francisco are basically twofold. There's rents and Google buses. So the Google buses are pretty simple. A number of people, developers who work at Google, live in San Francisco. Google is 35 miles south of San Francisco in a town called Mountain View. And Google realized at some point that all of these people driving their cars to the Google campus, they call it a campus, driving their cars was not the most environmentally, responsible thing in the world, and realized that it was an enormous amount of time wasted having people sitting behind the wheels of cars. And so they, rented a bunch of buses. They're fairly nice buses, but they're buses. And so people take these Google buses to work every day. And these buses are fairly visible. They're pretty large buses because a lot of people work at Google, and they show up on the streets of San Francisco. And they're a very clear, target, if you will. Probably not the right term for that. And the second thing that has happened is that in a very certain portion of the city, the rents have gone very high. Imagine renting a 3-bedroom apartment for $4,000 or $6,000, something like that. Absolutely crazy. To be sure, if you don't start to kind of piece together the context. So into all of this. Oh, and I should say one other thing. So there have been some protests against these Google buses. Now, none of this is very well thought out, but the concept is that the rich people on these buses are somehow destroying the fabric of San Francisco. They're these incredibly wealthy people who suck the soul out of the city, get on buses and glide out of town every day to this sort of emerald city down in Mountain View. and are somehow bad for the city. None of which is at all well thought out. They're raising rents for people who own home. We can go into it. There's a whole bunch of things that are wrong about that, but I think they should be obvious to most people in a world where the average person lives on $1 a day that having a thriving economic scenario in your town is a good thing. But let's talk about Kristallnacht for a second. So here is the into this scenario. Here is the utterly ridiculous thing that happened. A guy named Tom Perkins, a name partner, long since retired, of the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers, announces to the world via the Wall Street Journal that he believes that he and the people on the Google buses are victims of a modern-day Kristallnacht. His point being, and I use the term point in the the loosest way possible, his point being that the wealthy people are being singled out. Now he's including himself and the people on the Google bus are being singled out as the cause of all of society's ills, and this is similar to the Jews who were the victims of the Kristallnacht. Okay, Tom Perkins is a billionaire or a very, very wealthy man. He claims he's not a billionaire, but he was famously on 60 Minutes. He built, I think, the most expensive racing yacht in the world. That this guy compares himself to a bunch of people who ride buses to work. The fact that that's actually just the second most ridiculous part of this story is remarkable. The people who ride the Google buses are people who are riding buses to work. They're not flying jets to vacation. They're nice buses, I guess, as buses go. But they're buses, and they're people going to work. And there are people making admittedly big salaries, but those big salaries are something like $90,000, which is an enormous amount of money, no question. $130,000, $75,000 a year as a marketing manager. Certainly not the enemy. That Tom Perkins, a man who I would bet has not ridden a bus in something that looks like 40 years, that he would put himself on these buses with these workers, is ridiculous. And I use the word ridiculous here, but it's kind of probably the wrong word to use, because then you need another word to describe what he is saying in his next thought, which is that he is a victim, as the Jews were in Nazi Germany. And by the way, who was actually mad at Tom Perkins at any given point? I don't recall anybody saying anything negative about this guy. So in any case, there's the famous saying that any argument, when it devolves into comparing anything to Nazi Germany, the argument has reached its absolute low point. And I think this guy managed to get to an absolute low point really quicker than almost any other argument I've seen in history. No one's heard of this guy. No one's mad at this guy. Nobody cares about this guy, frankly. And he sort of dropped this this concept on Silicon Valley. So I think let's wrap this portion up by just saying, here at this time in the capital city, here in Silicon Valley, it has actually come to a point where some guy, a rich guy living on top of one of the highest buildings in San Francisco, has managed to compare himself to one of the darkest aspects in human history. Now, something that he said later. So he later, and I'm using air quotes here, apologized. He said, well, I may have, he apologized in the, what the worst apology in the world is, I'm sorry if some people may have been offended. He did kind of one of those apologies and said, well, my point remains, again, air quotes around point, but said, well, I misspoke. I shouldn't have used that word, Kristallnacht. Now, I've got to say, Kristallnacht is not a word or a concept that you sort of misspeak. It seems like something that you think about for a long time. You pull out of the history books because I frankly didn't remember that concept. Um, and while there's some possibility that this guy is, the old man King Lear out on the heath, just babbling, it just seems like this is something he thought through and thought was fairly clever, and obviously backfired. And I think, as is often the case, Jon Stewart summed this up the best when he said something like, and I paraphrase, and obviously I can't say nearly the tone that Jon Stewart does, but something along the lines of, why would a bunch of people on their way to work go and protest another group of people who are riding the bus to work? The whole thing is ridiculous. So let's talk a little bit briefly about what's actually happening here and put the darker side of this behind us. So a few people showed up. There's these Google buses stop and, at various points around the city. So there have been a few protests from, it's not clear who, actually. Apparently professional protesters. The protesters appear to be young people, certainly not minorities, protesting, not exactly clear what the problem is. But one thing they're protesting is the rising rents in San Francisco. And what this narrative is that San Francisco is this hive of artists and performers, and that these 3,000 or 4,000 people, tech workers, come into a city of 750,000, a Bay Area of 10 million or whatever it is, and push these artists out of their homes. And the character of the city becomes a little dimmer, a little sadder. It's possible, but my thought, a couple thoughts. First of all, I'm not sure that narrative is exactly true. They're paying rents. The average landlord in San Francisco is, I think, a 68-year-old woman who's inherited her house or bought her house a long time ago. So they're paying relatively high rents. I recently looked to rent a property, and what the realtor said is, the reason the rents are $6,000 is because 4 people who work at Google or Facebook are each paying $1,500 a month, and they're jamming themselves into a 3 or 4 bedroom unit. So in some sense, they're increasing the housing density, increasing the economic base of the city in a relatively low impact way. The second thing that's actually distasteful about this is the concept of, hey, new person go home, immigrant go home, would not be tolerated if this was any other class of people other than, a young tech worker is the expression that's generally used. But the concept of, hey, new people, you're not welcome around here is actually a fairly unpleasant concept. The other thing that's happening too is this is probably a very highly dramatic and highly visible issue. There was a recent article, I forget, I think it was a realtor who coined the term the Quad. And the Quad is a small area around Valencia Street, which is the hottest street in town. Mark Zuckerberg recently bought a house a couple blocks from Valencia Street in this area, and she defines this area, this Quad, as sort of probably a 6 block by 10 block area. It seems to me that this piece of theater, the Google buses and the rents and all of that, is largely taking place in this area called the Quad. There was another article recently that was amusing. That was a guy who was not amusing, that's the wrong term, but a guy who's a shop owner in a district called the Excelsior, which is literally a mile or two from Valencia Street, or from the area that's called the Quad, this super hot area. And this guy is basically bemoaning the fact that this wave has passed him by, that people aren't piling into his shop. I forget what kind of shop he has, and they're not driving up the price of his home. This is literally a block or two away. So, this has become a little bit of a meme and a concept and sort of the wealth class warfare thing. But I'm here to say this is actually not a thing. This is not a thing. I think San Francisco should be a place where immigrants are welcome. People who work at Google or the phone company or Facebook or for the government do not have to defend that they're good people, do not have to defend that they add value to the community in which they live. Hopefully this incident will perhaps continue to provide some entertainment for us. If you want to look something up, Joe Garofoli wrote a great article. He's the great writer for the San Francisco Chronicle. Wrote a great article about how to write about Silicon Valley, which is a fairly facetious look at this wealth disparity concept. Look it up. In any case, that's our brief podcast for today. Start out a little bit heavy there. Hopefully mellowed that out toward the end. And I want to thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch with me, tell me who you would like me to talk to, who you would like me to interview. I am Kent Lind, KentLand, on Twitter. And thanks a lot for listening. I will talk to you next time.